Okay, let's dive in. We're looking today at a policy that it feels almost like a throwback in some ways, but the impact is incredibly current. We're talking about the revival of reciprocal tariffs by President Trump back in the autumn of 2025.
Yeah, and this was a huge move, really sweeping, aimed at supposedly leveling the trade playing field. And we're not talking small targets. It was against over 180 countries.
Including all the big ones, right? China, the EU, Mexico, South Korea.
Yeah,
The list goes on.
exactly. And maybe we should clarify what reciprocal really meant here, because if you just saw the headlines, it might have sounded like just another tariff hike.
Good point.
This was very specific. It was designed to mirror their tariffs on our goods, a direct, tit-for-tat demand for parity.
A real shot across the bow.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating and what the data really bears out is that while it looks like it's all about international trade, it actually kicked off this major domestic quiet storm, as some are calling it.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to sort of frame that storm. We want to unpack how the administration tried to balance these, well, really conflicting goals.
Right. On one hand, aggressively protecting U.S. industries, manufacturing especially. But on the other hand, trying not to completely break the global system that, let's face it, American companies really depend on.
Yeah, that's the core tension, isn't it? How do you shield, say, U.S. steel makers without jacking up costs for companies like Ford or Intel, firms that need those global supply chains for parts, for components?
Exactly. And the data we're drawing on, it gives us a pretty clear picture of the immediate fallout. It lets us contrast this 2025 approach pretty starkly with the trade strategies we saw under the previous administration.
Okay, let's get into the policy rollout itself, because it was fast, and like you said, the data showed almost immediately it was, well, a sword with two edges.
Definitely two edges. The administration used a pretty heavy legal tool, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA.
Right, IEPA.
To impose these tariffs that basically mirrored whatever duties our trading partners had in place. We're talking levies up to 30% on really key imports, things like metals, chemicals, electronics.
And the stated goal was?
Well, officially, it was about countering what they saw as imbalances. You know, Beijing's subsidies, those EU agricultural barriers that have been a sticking point for years. And crucially, the big promise, bring back those high-paying manufacturing jobs to the U.S.
And there was an initial positive sign, wasn't there? Markets kind of liked it briefly, saw it as leverage maybe.
Yeah, a very brief rally. Some saw it as, a tough negotiating stance. And we did see some early reports like domestic steel producers getting about a 10% bump in orders because overseas competition suddenly got more expensive.
But that initial optimism, it didn't really hold.
Not for long.
Yeah.
Because this is where the policy just slammed into the reality of, well, how globalized everything is now, especially supply chains. Well, the policy was maybe aimed at protecting the final product made here, but it didn't seem to fully grasp how deeply integrated U.S. firms are globally. I mean, the analysis shows that for many U.S. products, think about a Ford truck or even your Apple phone, up to, get this, 70% of the manufacturing value comes from imported components.
70%? Wow. Okay, that's huge. And that feels like the crux of why it backfired at home, right?
Exactly.
I mean, if 70% relies on imports, wouldn't policymakers anticipate that slapping big tariffs on those imports is just shooting yourself in the foot? Was it an oversight or maybe a calculated risk?
The evidence points towards a risk that just very quickly turned into economic pain here. Those tariffs on components, they raised overall production costs for American firms by something like 15 to 25%.
So you're not just hitting a foreign competitor, you're essentially taxing your own companies.
Precisely. We're taxing ourselves. And you see that really clearly in the auto sector.
Right, the car manufacturers.
They suddenly faced an extra, $2,000 to $3,500 per vehicle in production costs. Just tacked on.
And the ripple effect.
Immediate.
Yeah.
Projections started flying around. Maybe 80,000 job losses just in that sector. And a potential 12% drop in sales because, well, the cars just got too expensive for people to buy.
And it wasn't just cars, I assume.
Oh, no. Think about pharmaceuticals. Hugely dependent on global sourcing. The tariffs created these critical shortages of active ingredients, APIs, often coming from India, from China.
Things people rely on daily.
Absolutely. Prices for essentials, like insulin, jump 15 to 20%. That hits household budgets hard, raises healthcare costs across the board.
And the irony here, what happened with steel? The very sector this was supposed to help the most.
Yeah, this is kind of amazing. Even with the tariff protection, Domestic U.S. steel prices climbed way higher than competitors, 18 to 40% higher than, say, Japan.
So they couldn't compete globally anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It completely wiped out any potential export advantage they might have gained. Maybe they felt safer from imports at home, but they were priced out of the international market by their own government's policy, essentially.
Okay, so producers are hit. What about just regular consumers buying everyday things?
They felt it too. Retail staples, clothes, appliances saw markups averaging 10 to 25%. That adds up. Roughly $1,300 a year extra for the average household budget.
$1,300. That's not small change, especially with other inflation pressures.
Not at all. And on top of that, you had tech giants like Intel warning about potentially 12% higher chip prices. This was because of duties on crucial inputs, rare earths, and things, mostly from Asia, which directly complicates that whole big push for U.S. semiconductor independence funded by the TIPS Act.
So the policy wasn't really reshoring jobs as intended. It was just raising prices and, rerouting supply chains?
That's what the data suggests. Instead of the manufacturing back, a lot of firms just shifted. They found new suppliers in places like Vietnam or Thailand.
Yeah.
They kept their global flows going just around the tariffs, bypassing the whole domestic goal.
Which must have created enormous pressure back in Washington. This led to what some sources called a legal earthquake, right?
Absolutely. The economic pain translated pretty quickly into political and legal action. By September 2025, you saw this powerful coalition forming, and it was bipartisan.
Who was involved?
15 different industry groups, a real cross-section, plus 8 industrial states. And crucially, states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, big manufacturing hubs that were feeling the pinch, they filed this massive lawsuit against the White House.
Challenging the use of IEPA itself.
Yes, that was the core argument. They said using these broad emergency powers for tariffs like this was an overreach, that it violated the Constitution's checks and balances, basically bypassing Congress's power over commerce.
And that case moved fast.
Very fast. Straight up to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were scheduled for November 5th. Billions in potential tariff refunds hanging in the balance.
So the administration was facing a serious legal threat to the whole policy.
Which forced a pivot, a course correction. In October, just before the Supreme Court arguments, they shifted the legal justification, moved it away from the shaky IEPA foundation.
To what?
To Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This allows the president to impose tariffs based on national security.
Ah, the national security argument. We've seen that before with steel and aluminum.
Exactly. It's a different legal beast. And this shift is really important for you, the listener, to grasp. It wasn't just legal shuffling.
Why does the specific law matter so much, IEPA versus Section 232?
Well, it's about stability, predictability, and frankly, how much power the executive branch has over food. IEPA gives the president these sweeping emergency powers, but they're often seen as legally vulnerable, maybe stepping on Congress's toes regarding commerce. Section 232, though, is different. It's Congress specifically giving the president authority to act on trade for national defense reasons. It's generally seen as a much stronger legal footing, much harder for courts to overturn. So switching to 232 is basically an attempt to shield the tariffs from that looming Supreme Court challenge.
A defensive legal move. But they also did something else, something more pragmatic. This Annex 3 list.
Yes, and this is fascinating because it's such a clear admission of global reality. The Annex 3 exemptions list.
What did it exempt?
Duties were waived on essential goods that, frankly, the U.S. just doesn't produce enough of domestically or can't produce efficiently.
Like what specifically?
The list mentioned things like gold, certain complex LED components, tropical agricultural products, think coffee, cocoa, and critically unpatented pharmaceutical inputs, basic ingredients for medicines.
So it's kind of funny, right? A policy aimed at self-sufficiency needs a list of things we admit we can't be self-sufficient in.
It really underscores the dependence, doesn't it? It keeps the core tariffs, the ones aimed at China and the EU, largely in place under the new Section 232 justification, dodging the IEPA lawsuit. But it definitely tempers that rhetoric about complete self-reliance.
And they threw in some other relief, too, like for the auto sector.
Yeah, practical measures. Auto incentives got extended out to 2030, basically acknowledging those high component costs weren't going away quickly and manufacturers needed help coping.
Okay, so this constant shifting, the legal battles, the exemptions, it really leads to the bigger picture, doesn't it?
It does, because the final Supreme Court ruling on this, whenever it comes, and how it interprets Section 232, that's going to define the future of executive trade power. And that affects how predictable the global business environment will be for everyone.
Which is a perfect transition. Let's spend our last few minutes comparing these two trade playbooks. The Trump 2025 approach versus the Biden administration's record from, say, 2021 to 2025, just to give listeners context for all this volatility.
Good idea. So the Trump 2025 approach, as we've discussed, it's really marked by these unilateral actions, using tariffs as a big stick to try and force bilateral deals.
High risk, high reward, maybe.
Well, definitely high volatility in the short term. One analysis we looked at from Yale estimated the 2025 tariffs could bring in about $3.1 trillion in revenue. Sounds huge, but it was largely offset by estimated losses, about $582 billion from retaliatory tariffs by other countries, plus significant drags on efficiency across the U.S. economy because of those higher input costs and disruptions.
Okay, so that's the 2025 picture. How did the Biden administration's approach differ in the preceding years?
It was much more measured, more multilateral. Now, importantly, they actually kept many of the Trump-era China tariffs in place.
Right, suggesting some bipartisan agreement on the China challenge itself.
Absolutely. But the method was different. The Biden team layered in a lot more diplomacy, trying to mitigate the global fallout, working with allies. Think about initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. That brought together 14 nations. The goal wasn't tariffs, but cooperation, building resilient supply chains, setting digital trade rules, specifically as a counterweight to China's influence, but through partnership.
And deals with Europe, too.
Yeah, agreements with the EU to harmonize rules on things like digital trade, critical minerals, trying to avoid broad tariff wars, maintain some stability.
And the economic results of that more multilateral approach?
Generally steadier. Predictability was prioritized. Now, the overall trade deficit did grow modestly during that period, about 18.8%. But critically, it happened without those sharp spikes in costs for households and businesses that we're seeing now under the reciprocal tariffs.
And job creation.
Job growth was strong, particularly in sectors targeted by legislation like the Chi-PS Act, semiconductors, renewables. It was more about targeted subsidies and investment, less about broad, blunt tariffs.
So the core difference really comes down to unilateral force versus multilateral frameworks.
I think that's fair. Trump's 2025 strategy emphasizes confrontation, using tariffs as leverage. Biden's strategy prioritized alliances and predictability. And, focusing on alliances helped keep U.S. GDP growth averaging around a steady 2.5% during that time.
And crucially, avoided these intense legal battles and industry clashes that are now really testing the current administration's policy and potentially executive power itself.
Exactly. Which brings us back to the immediate stakes.
Right. The fate of these current tariffs really hangs on that Supreme Court ruling expected around November. And that decision, whichever way it goes, could reshape how presidents use trade power for decades, especially defining those national security boundaries.
And for you, the listener, this whole episode really highlights the dual nature of trade policy today. Yes, it can be a tool, maybe even a necessary one sometimes, to push for fairness, to counter perceived unfair practices, but it carries huge risks. Risks to the very global innovation networks, the supply chains, the collaborations that drive the tech revolutions we rely on. Those systems need a degree of stability to work.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, something to chew on. Considering that Annex 3 lists all those essential things, the gold, the pharma inputs, the components the U.S. admits it struggles to produce, if tariffs are meant to protect and grow domestic industries, what does it say when we have to explicitly exempt so many crucial goods? Does that heavy reliance on global networks for things we can't easily make here mean that the whole idea of full self-sufficiency in the modern economy is maybe just an illusion?